When the Sega Genesis showed up in North America in 1989, it was launched with a barrage of TV and print ads. You couldn't watch a cartoon or pick up a gaming magazine without seeing Sega's new 16-bit powerhouse. I didn't get mine until Christmas that year, and the following year was full of fantastic titles that made owning the platform extremely exciting. But as fun as that was, I can't help but feel the Sega Genesis really didn't come into its own until 1991, when an absolute deluge of classic game titles made their debut. When 1991 came to a close, Sega had weathered the release of the Super Nintendo in fine style, and was set to give the competition the fight of their lives as the best 16-bit console money could buy. In this episode, we are going to take a look at the games that defined the Genesis in 1991, and made it a must-own device for millions of gamers in North America and beyond. Hope you guys enjoy 1991 and the Sega Genesis. We begin this journey with the incredibly weird Decap Attack. This one was based on a completely different Japanese release and reskinned with a new story and characters. The core gameplay comes off pretty solid, and the sound and visuals had that distinct Genesis feel that was so well defined by prominent Japanese releases. The horror comedy theme serves the game well, with an almost Halloween-esque atmosphere. I was also really happy with the way Game Ground turned out on the Genesis. This arcade port takes the idea of getting from point A to point B and turns it into a run-and-gun survival-thon. You get multiple characters with different weapons, and it's two-player co-op. The graphics won't blow you away, but the replay value is high, and the soundtrack is awesome. If you were a fan of NFL football, the Joe Montana series got its start in 1991. Things began extremely tame, with Sega having to outsource the original from the same developer that did Madden for Electronic Arts. While that first game was nowhere near as well done as Madden, it did give Sega and Blue Sky Software enough time to finish their own game and release it later that same year, Joe Montana Sports Talk Football 2. This represented a wild new direction with more detailed visuals, improved color, new viewpoints, and running commentary for every play. These games began a fantastic series that would run the entire life of the console. Midnight Resistance was also a 1991 release, a port of the Data East Arcade original. The gameplay to this one was fun enough on its own, but the entire package is made so much better by one of the best soundtracks ever developed for this hardware. No joke, man, this stuff is so strong you can listen to it outside the game, and it really drove the entire experience. I don't mind telling you it blew away the arcade version in sound, and it's required listening for every Sega fan. The core experience is a fairly decent Contra clone as well. Sword of Vermilion was an interesting release that year, an action RPG that uses a number of different gameplay styles and perspectives to tell its narrative. It's often erroneously credited to AM2, but this was released before AM2 was formed. In fact, a number of the team involved had little to do with anything the proper AM2 actually developed. Yu Suzuki was involved as producer, however, and it certainly stood out among the genre regulars that so often copycatted one another. It's one of the reasons the Genesis felt like its own thing, a game that really had no equal in design. It went in a different direction and gave us something that felt like nothing you had played before. Airbuster is a game I don't think gets enough credit on the Genesis. This was based on an arcade game developed by Kaneko, and I thought it looked and played really solid. The challenge is manageable, and the nice backgrounds rounded out a game well worth playing. Sega of America's internal team, the Sega Technical Institute, released its first game in 1991, Dick Tracy. I quite enjoyed this, mainly for its detailed visuals and traditional arcade gameplay. It had some nice variety in the fact that many areas allowed you to attack enemies in the background and the foreground. That's on top of some melee-only areas, as well as some vehicle-based levels. The difficulty ramps up something fierce in the late game, but it's still a fun overall adventure that is built in the Rolling Thunder mold. Shoot 'em ups continued to do well on the Genesis with the release of Gyarus. This one got all kinds of nice review scores thanks to an incredible presentation and gameplay that allowed you to steal your enemy's weapons, 18 in total. That allowed a lot of variety in the way you tackled the stages and bosses, and I rank it up there close to the fantastic Thunder Force titles. The soundtrack holds up well too. Another one that made big waves on the Genesis that year was Musha, a Compile-developed vertically scrolling shooter with an outstanding soundtrack. It's one of those games that has increased in popularity over the years and has become an often cited must-play for newcomers. Some call it too easy, but I found it quite challenging and it provided many hours of top-notch gameplay. Released an entire year after the Japanese version, Batman the video game finally showed up in North America courtesy of Sunsoft. This was love at first sight for me on every level. I enjoyed the original motion picture, and the Genesis game lived up to that experience in every way. Gotham City was captured perfectly here, and the soundtrack was the stuff of FM perfection. It's true the gameplay is simple and straightforward, but it's the kind of design that feels right the entire trip and never stops being fun. They even threw in some nice vehicle-based levels for a bit of variety. It's one of my favorites and I play it often. Wings of War was an interesting shoot 'em up with some nice special effects. If it wasn't the backgrounds pulling off some insane layering, it was some great sprite work showing off eye-popping animation. Some of those later stages were well worth the trip all by themselves. Valis 3 continued the epic series that followed our hero Yuko as she wields the Valis sword against evil. This is perhaps the best game in the series, and the Genesis version has an outstanding soundtrack and some fun boss encounters. It was interesting seeing this series evolve on Sega's platform, and it's worth looking at all of them even if you've played them elsewhere. Shadow Dancer technically launched at the very end of 1990, but we are still going to talk about it here because it was so damn good. This is not a direct port of the arcade game of the same name, but it's still quite close in design to the first two arcade Shinobi entries that fans should absolutely eat it up. The visuals are rock solid, the soundtrack is top tier, and the gameplay features a canine companion that can be used to subdue enemies. At its core, it's more arcade-style Shinobi, but it's so well done, you'll love every step of its challenging adventure. Believe it or not, 1991 was the year Sonic the Hedgehog first graced the Genesis, nearly 2 years after the platform debuted in North America. This game's success speaks for itself. I can piss and moan all day about why I think it's not as good as everyone says it is, but there is no denying the raw appeal it held back then. Gamers far and wide were mesmerized by its colorful graphics, upbeat soundtrack, and easy to pick up mechanics. I have to admit that even as someone who didn't love this exactly, it still fills a place of nostalgia that is as strong as the best games on the platform. The sights and sounds never really get old, and its locations are prominently featured in many of the games that followed it for a reason. It lit a fire under the platform in North American and PAL regions that allowed it to compete with Nintendo for years. Without it, I'm not so sure the legacy of the Genesis pans out the same. Alien Storm was a sort of a sci-fi remake of Golden Axe, complete with a zany story and multiplayer for you and your friends. A nice addition here is that it uses two gameplay styles to keep things interesting. One is a side-scrolling shooter beat-em-up hybrid, and the other is a first-person shooter. While it is heavily inspired by the arcade game of the same name, it differs in numerous ways, particularly in the enemy and stage design. It's still a fun trip that has different weapons, a full-on alien invasion, and a decent challenge. Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin was one of those games the first few times you played it really pissed you off. It had a time element that, if not overcome, ends the game no matter how far you had progressed. Basically, you need to take down some bad guys, get some keys, and stop some bombs from exploding. Fortunately, the gameplay is well enough done that if you keep at it, this can genuinely be a fun one to beat. You'll run into Venom, Dr. Octopus, Electro, and a few other familiar faces. It's better on the Sega CD, but that version didn't land until a few years later. The Sega Genesis began to develop a reputation as a device for older kids by 1991. and games like Road Rash contributed heavily to that. This was a combat racing game where you barreled down the back roads of sunny California, beating the hell out of any competitor that dares get in your way. It has one of the most memorable soundtracks of the 16-bit era, and the gameplay is virtually timeless in its fun factor. You get chased by cops, get access to powerful crotch rockets, and you even get a weapon or two. It spawned 2 sequels on the Genesis that also had many reasons to love them, but I think this one right here will always be my favorite. 1991 was also the year the great Streets of Rage graced us with its presence. Even a Final Fight fan like me had to stop and take notice at how well this was made, and how incredible it played. I reveled in its gritty world and looked forward to every battle that took place there. You had so many iconic areas, shipyards, business districts, and of course, right out there on the beach itself. Yuzo Koshiro's soundtrack was certainly a huge part of that, a ballad that still resonates today as strongly as it did some 30 years ago. Once you figure in the multiplayer and the different endings, you have one of the finest beat-em-ups Sega ever produced and one of the standout series on their home consoles. Sega had a grand history of bringing Capcom arcade games to the Genesis, and Mercs was no different. This run-and-gun classic didn't turn out so bad considering it was cut back to just 8 megabits, and it includes an original mode with new stages and a completely different progression and weapon system. It did lose the multiplayer, which was a huge bummer, but it gained enough extras to make a worthwhile addition to the library. Shining in the Darkness kicked off that venerable series with an outstanding first entry. The evil Dark Soul has your father and the princess, and only you can get them back. This was an RPG of the dungeon crawling variety, and it was a joy to discover. It doesn't waste much time fumbling around an overworld searching for your next objective. Here you'll be waist deep in enemies nearly every step of the way with very little downtime. It's streamlined, easy to get into, and a great RPG for those that typically don't find themselves enthralled with the genre. Electronic Arts made a huge splash on the Genesis in 1991 with countless ports of popular computer titles. Buck Rogers, Starflight, Might and Magic, and King's Bounty, just to name a few. These games added a variety to the Genesis library that complemented the Japanese-developed software really well, mainly because they were so different in how they looked, played, and sounded. One of my favorites from this bunch is the incredibly creepy and very difficult The Immortal. These maze-like halls contain death around every corner. Making any progress is a badge of honor, but it's the kind of trip you are proud of for hanging in there and getting the job done. Electronic Arts also outdid themselves with another John Madden, now with a larger playbook, instant replay, play reviews, and much improved AI. It also added all the teams missing in the previous game, 28 in total. It absolutely pissed all over the slow and choppy version for the Super Nintendo that year, and paved the way for even better games to follow. Toe Jam and Earl also showed up in 1991, in what was one of the strangest games to grace the Genesis that year. Our funktastic duo has crashed on Earth and must find the pieces of their ship so they can get back home. It has a bunch of wacky enemies, 2-player co-op, and is quite deceptive in its challenge. What appears as a simple kids game is actually a really hard maze adventure, and you'll need to put in some serious effort to see the end. The year just kept getting better and better with the release of El Viento. This one gets a lot of mixed reactions thanks to its challenge and unorthodox gameplay, but hang in there and I promise you'll find something well worth playing. It's connected to a few other Genesis releases in terms of story, but it was best right here. Quackshot was nothing short of a winner from the moment you started playing it. It picks up where Castle of Illusion left off, giving us another Disney adventure with appealing play mechanics, colorful graphics, and even a few puzzles to solve. I really enjoyed the Sega-made Disney titles, and their level of easy to pick up and play fun was much appreciated at a time when a lot of games were soul-crushingly difficult. Road Blasters was an arcade port that doesn't get nearly enough love on the Genesis. Not only does it play well, but look at the visuals here. It looks so similar to the arcade game it's unreal. This car combat game has you blowing stuff up, collecting items, and avoiding obstacles. If arcade action is even remotely interesting to you, this one should be a must-play. Caliber 50 was an interesting overhead run-and gun because of its slower pace and even difficulty. The visuals put you in mind of a Sega Master System title, but I really enjoyed the way it eased you into the action. There's even quite a bit of exploration here. I think fans of Rambo 2 on the Master System and Rambo 3 on the Genesis should enjoy this one quite a bit. We end our journey through 1991 with the tactical RPG War Song, the English localization of the first Landgrisser title. Your job is typically to clear the battlefield of enemy units while retaining all of your own. Be careful because this is one of those games where permadeath is very much part of the gameplay, and it can be heartbreaking to lose a member of your party you've spent a lot of time with. The hilarious animations are a comical veneer for its extremely deep and challenging gameplay. Hours upon hours of challenge await you in this one. So there we go, a quick rundown of what made the Genesis so special in 1991. The thing is, this is but a tiny taste of the titles the platform received that year. There are many more, and I encourage you to investigate all the great games the Genesis has to offer. And what a time it was to be a gamer. In 1991, the Super Nintendo burst onto the scene and offered up a volley of goodness all its own. Not to mention that the TurboGrafx 16 really started to come into its own that year. There was so much to see and play, and because these companies often went in very different directions, each one had a feel all its own. It's why the 16-bit era was so special. 3 consoles producing games that were largely so different from one another, you were compelled to see them all because of the sheer variety. That came to an end in the generations that would follow, but I sure am glad I was there to see it while creativity was at an all-time high. Even after all these years, 1991 still really sticks out in my mind as the year the Genesis really made it clear it wasn't going anywhere. It earned its place beside millions of televisions across the globe. As a Sega fan, it was the only time I ever felt like Sega could do no wrong, and the future was as bright as it would ever be. To say that was special is an understatement, and it was an unforgettable part of my Sega journey. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.